Okay, can you hear me? All right. Apologies. I decided to use a dark slide design today. That was maybe not awesome, but we'll do our best. So this is sort of very early stage work, and I'm interested in sort of feedback about the notion of story state, which I'm going to be talking about. So okay.
Oh, might have to just click on the second.
Click over here.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So this is a kind of least common denominator interactive narrative system. You have a state that the system is in. There's a state space that the state is moving through. The state determines what text you print, and the choices that are available to the player. They make a choice. That then feeds back and changes what state you're in. So state here can mean lots of different things. If it's a twine game, then it's just what node are you in the graph. If you're doing sort of more of an AI planning-based system, then maybe you have, much more elaborate state representation with state variables that, affect what action preconditions are satisfied and they're changed by effects and so on. And then sometimes there's also just state, which is some systems keep track of which scene are you in, and that's going to be a state variable system. So at a conference like AID, we're going to be leaning more toward the more elaborate state representations and actions that have preconditions, effects, and so on. And I now want to pause for a moment and talk about a game of Fiasco that I played with my students a few years ago. So we were playing the DC-73 play set. So Fiasco is a tabletop role-playing game. It's an improvisational game where you improvise a Coen Brothers style caper gone wrong film. And this was about politicians and spies and so on during the Cold War. And so the story world in that has state variables like who's president, who belongs to what party, who's sleeping with whom, who has pictures of them sleeping with whom, and goals are things like become president, save the world from the commies, save the world from the capitalists, get revenge on somebody, get that nice juicy defense contract. And this is all great, and we're playing, and then one of my students says, well, now you're going to, says to, or her character says to another character, well, now you're going to do what I tell you to. And we're like, why? And she says, because I'm a vampire. And we all look at one another and we're like, cool. And so now she's a vampire. And so now we have a whole new state space for our interactive narrative with new state variables like who's been bitten, and new goals like make the vampire matriarch president, and goals like bite Nancy Pelosi and bite the director of national intelligence. So when you write this story, the story changes. And the state space of the story world changes as the story world changes as part of the writing process. So I'm going to call that another kind of state, story state, which is a terrible name, and I'm sorry, and it's not even a completely baked concept, but it's a distinction that I want to get at. And I want to get at it because for interactive narrative, especially with things like tabletop narrative, you really are writing it as you go along. And you want to be able to have that kind of freedom to change the story world as you're going along. Change what genre are we in? What's the tone of it? What are the properties of these characters? And in these kinds of genres, like improv and tabletop RPGs and serial fiction, you are free to change that stuff from one episode to the next. And the only principle is that you can't contradict anything that has already been told in the story. So I think I'm going to call this story state. Feel free to come up with a better term. I think that this is getting at a set of issues that are kind of underexplored in interactive narrative, and that I'm interested in. So Retcon is just a kind of first effort at let's make a system that supports this kind of thing. Gives the player a limited ability to play with these kinds of properties of the story world. You can vary tone and genre and things like that. And it's doing least commitment modeling of the story world, where the only thing that's settled about the story world is the implications of the particular things that have already happened. The basic architecture is it's a storylet system. The story is authored as a set of fragments. But what we're going to do is we're going to allow the author to tag the fragments with assumptions about the story. And then we'll filter fragments from consideration that contradict things that are already established by other fragments. So formally, there are more Greek letters in the paper. Formally, pick your favorite classical logic. Doing it in ASP is more complicated because it's not a classical logic. Happy to talk about that offline. The author then tags every story fragment with a set of assumptions in that logic, a set of statements. They also author a kind of a domain theory, just a set of other statements about what the implications of the different assumptions are. And then some set of fragments in the story are consistent with one another if and only if the fragments, assumptions, together with whatever our domain theory is satisfiable. And we can test that with that solved. So as we play the story and add new fragments, each fragment grows the set of assumptions, narrows the space of possible models of the assumption, the set of possible worlds, and thereby narrows the space of possible future fragments as more and more become inconsistent with what's already established. So here's an example. Jamie and Joey are driving to visit Nana. At least one of them is going to be related to Nana, but otherwise we don't know anything. We don't know their genders. We don't know whether they're blood relations or friends or lovers. We don't know their attitudes toward Nana or Nana's attitudes toward them. We don't know whether Nana is a kindly old lady or a vampire matriarch. We're going to allow the player, in some sense, to make some of those decisions. So here is a kind of, here's a subset of a domain theory for this. At least one of Jamie's family and Joey's family must be true. If they're both family, they're not lovers. And they're lovers if and only if they're either a gay couple or a straight couple. An example fragment, we can give the text for the fragment, which is, remember when we were kids and Nana caught us smoking weed? Yeah, I couldn't sit for a week. then we tag that with the implications of it, which is that they must both be found. Because otherwise, Anna probably would not be beating them. Here's another one. Don't worry, Nana's not so bad. She's just a little old world. You mean she's a homophobe? A polite homophobe. I feel so much better. Okay, that implies that Nana's a homophobe. And in context, they're a gay couple. And so what we want the system to realize is that these are both valid fragments, but they're not consistent with one another. Because if we establish the smoky weed one, we know they're both family, which means they're non-lovers. But if we establish the homophobe one, we know they're a gay couple, which means they're lovers, and so we have a contradiction. So the system filters that and says if we deploy one of those fragments, we can't deploy the other one. There's a bunch of related work. I think sort of the most salient one here is Justice Robertson's work on state superposition in experience management. And I've got to be out of time by now, but future work. Writing SAP solvers and logic programming code is my comfort zone. Writing fiction is scary. So I still have to do more of this part. But I'm interested in exploring how we present these kinds of choices to the player that have sort of wide implications into what the tone of the story will be, what the genre will be, what kinds of topics come up, etc., and explore sort of the aesthetics of interacting with the player when they're choosing fragments that could change the story world in significant ways. This is built using a SAT solver called CatSat, which is really designed for different use cases. It would be better with more conventional SAT solver. It's always nicer to have a more expressive logic. All right, conclusion. I think story state, although admittedly a somewhat nebulous concept, is interesting. It's underexplored, and surprisingly, it's pretty straightforward to implement. All right, that's it.